we have read Chapter 12, Environment and Sustainability. I want to link that back to the last chapter we were talking about in terms of the global economy. I was so excited to talk about the global economy last week, but I fear that I may have gotten too excited and got way into some details that were too boring for people. So in today's class, I'm going to try not to get so detailed, but we're going to go over in some ways the global economy, but linked up to this issue of our environment. So going back 15, 20, 30,000 years or so, what we see in human evolution is that humans go all over the place. Human beings spread out all over the world. And the way that humans did this was by using hunting and gathering. There was no agriculture. That was a sophisticated system which was very adaptable to different climates and environments. As we talked about, people were always interconnected and trading and borrowing with each other. They were never in isolated groups, but they spread out in different environments. There's something else that's interesting about this, is that human beings spread out into places that we might consider too extreme to be habitable. The Arctic, the Amazon, different parts of Australia, the tropics. And in some cases, it was people themselves who kind of worked with this environment using different cultural adaptations and made those places, transformed them into a more habitable environment than they were before. There is no way, it seemed, that humans could live in these kinds of places. And in these different locations, people developed different ways of relating to the environment and securing a subsistence or sustenance from the land and sea, including things we talked about in the last chapter, like small-scale growing and agricultural, as well as herding animals, pastoralism, and of course, hunting and gathering, which are often combined with these ideas and mixed together and developing in all kinds of different ways. Now, certainly during this time, humans were modifying the environment. There is some debate about whether human beings hunted down the megafauna, the big animals on various continents, and they were the ones who were responsible for its extinction. There were also some times that agricultural systems or other forms of extraction failed due to overuse of a particular environment. But for the most part, as of about 500 years ago, 1500 CE or 1500 AD, if you prefer, what we might consider is that humans had adapted to all these different environments, were in contact with each other, had developed all kinds of different forms of economics and political systems. And we might think of this as a kind of human achievement. I've underlined the words human adaptive strategies because I don't usually plug my own classes, but since nobody's here, it doesn't matter. Next semester in spring 2024, right here in this room from 8:40 a.m. to 10 a.m., that's the theme we're going to be dealing with, is cultural ecology, starting with the book Human Adaptive Strategies, which is exactly these ideas about humans interacting with their environment. We'll then read a book, that's kind of a textbooky book. We'll then read a book called Fresh Banana Leaves, Healing Indigenous Landscapes Through Indigenous Science by Dr. Jessica Hernandez. Really interesting book, just came out not a couple of years ago, and will give us a kind of counterpoint, perhaps, to some of the textbooky type stuff. And then we'll finish up with a book, an edited volume called Anthropological Optimism, Engaging the Power of What Could Go Right, which is very strange because anthropologists are often the cynics and the pessimists. So I'm looking forward to reading about how we're going to have anthropological optimism here. We'll see how it goes. But going back to our point, we can look at this as a sign in which people had developed all of these different adaptive strategies. We could look at the ways in which indigenous peoples were actively managing their environments and practicing a form of science based on evidence and empirical knowledge, deep knowledge of their environments. And I'm going to hope to believe that we can seize this optimism about the ways in which people have adapted to their environments with the past and been sustainable and those kinds of things. I'm teaching a first-year class. I asked the students what they wanted to be, and only one student said he wanted to have something to do with the environment. And then at the end of his thing, he said, if the planet isn't gone by then. So it was kind of sad because, you know, there's a lot of environmental pessimism out there, and I understand that. I do get that, and I'm probably, you know, I'm on the tail end of life and you're on the beginning end of life, and it's hard to be optimistic about the planet, but hopefully we can be more.
I don't think you're that old.
Huh?
I don't think you're that old.
So my big point here is that you should beware of the people who blame environmental crisis, or really all kinds of things, on the human species. The idea, and perhaps you've heard this, I hear this a lot, you know, like wherever humans go, we just destroy everything, or wherever humans are, they're always going to fight each other, etc. I guess I would say what it does is it takes away the blame from where it should be, in the sense that we're blaming people who actually developed systems and ideas which were very sustainable in their environment. And in fact, when we see human beings in other parts of the world, they haven't always messed it up. I've called in somebody from the Matrix to explain this perspective. Let's see if, I guess I would still say, though, it is interesting that Agent Smith has this perspective. In some ways, now that I look back on that film, he's kind of like the representative of white supremacy, trying to tell Morpheus what to do. But, you know, he's incorrect. You shouldn't be telling Morpheus that, because in fact, like I said, the human species has not always reproduced and used up all their natural resources everywhere. That's something that came about relatively recently. So watch out for people like that. The other thing you should watch out for are people who blame all of our problems on agriculture. And this has also become sort of a popular position. Actually, the person who most promoted this, or promoted this first, was our old friend Jared Diamond, who we saw back and talking to us about sex, who wrote an article in 1987 called "The Worst Mistake in the History of the Human Race," which he said was farming or agriculture. Or you can hear about it from this guy. Kind of sad that he has more likes and views on this one video than I have on my whole YouTube channel, but there he is. He does a pretty good job with this article and telling us about the worst mistake in the history of the human race. The problem with this is, as you've heard me say already, that agriculture was quite sustainable in various parts of the world. It's only in certain places, and we might say industrial agriculture, in which it kind of goes wrong. So, you know, we have to watch out. The other thing about this is, if agriculture is our mistake, how do you fix it? It's almost like Agent Smith. You'd probably need to wipe everybody out with a virus in order to get us away from something else. So it's kind of a solution that cannot be sustained in any way. That said, a lot of people have been wondering or talking to us about the time that we live in now, which people have taken to calling the Anthropocene, a time in which human technology, human action in the world outweighs everything else. So transforms everything else. one of you who's not here was talking about this book, Beyond the Big Ditch, about the Panama Canal, and this idea that you can cut through a whole continent and make it easier to ship things and the consequences of doing that. Another of you who's not here talked about this book, Consuming Ocean Island, which is a pretty sad story. It's hard to have anthropological optimism after you read this story, which is about an island where basically they moved all the people off and then they just mined it for phosphate until it was gone. And now it doesn't even exist. So it's a pretty dramatic story, and it shows us this kind of way in which humans seem to have become not all powerful because we mess up everything, but we have outweighing other creatures in our use of the environment. Now, some people have asked, well, when did this epoch of the Anthropocene begin? There's been some debate about this. There's debate about if we really should be using the term in the Holocene. Some people want to say it began 12,000 years ago with agriculture. As you know, I'm already against that idea because people practice agriculture in a very sustainable way all across the world in different places for a long time. Didn't seem to have that big of an effect. Other people want to locate it more in the 19th century when people were moving around, big migrations, the Industrial Revolution. Other people say it happened in the 1950s with the atomic bomb, the nuclear testing. For those of you in archaeology, you sometimes date things BP, before present. And the year for BP is 1950 because that was the year that the whole atmosphere changed because of radiation. It's never the same again. My own preference, my take on this, is to follow the lead of some researchers who argue that we can actually find geological evidence in ice cores for some huge events in the year 1610. And basically what their argument is that it was the encounter between Europe and the Americas, the demographics of genocide with the indigenous Americans and the demographics of genocide with the enslavement of Africans brought into the New World, which began this transformation. And I think it's worth thinking about this era, the last 400 to 500 years, as being truly when people, the Anthropocene, started to do weird things with the planet. So we talked about this a little bit in the last class, but from around 1500, by 1610, it was already quite evident of massive demographic decline of Native Americans or people indigenous to the Americas. The people coming in justified what they were doing, the seizure of land, by a couple different ideas. One was that, and again, this relates back to our ideas about the global economy, the idea that hunters and gatherers were not efficient. They were not efficiently using the land. Perhaps you've heard this in school, that like, it takes 10 acres of land to support one hunter-gatherer, but we could plant that with wheat and all of a sudden we'll be supporting hundreds of people. So there's this idea of efficiency. And there was also the idea that hunters and gatherers weren't working the land. This was Locke's labor theory of land, which meant that the people who worked it should own it. And as a consequence, and this actually has ramifications up until this day, people still cite this in order to counteract indigenous land claims. They say that they're not working the land like it should be worked. And so these were sort of justificatory ideas. What happened in the Americas and other parts of the world is people began to mine different places. We talked about Potosí, for example, mining silver, gold, other phosphates we just saw on that island, and setting up plantations that would grow things like coffee, sugar, tea, especially sugar, but other crops, and send them halfway around the world. Now, First, there was the genocidal supplanting of indigenous peoples, but this was only made possible by an enslavement of African peoples, which also had a massive demographic effect within Africa. That's something that's not always talked about. We here talk about what happens in the Americas when people are brought forcibly to the Americas, but it also caused a whole bunch of demographic consequences within Africa as people began to respond to and basically sell into the burgeoning slave trade. So I talked about this in the last class, that in some ways, a lot of these things then became forgotten in the Industrial Revolution, but it was really built on these resources. Actually, I thought that was another good thing that Clint Smith emphasized, was how much wealth was actually the enslaved themselves, who were the biggest resource, the most, in sort of numerical terms, if you wanted to numerize it, the biggest source of wealth in the Americas. So the US, or the Industrial Revolution, was in fact built upon and intensified from these kinds of resources. Also, in the last class, we did talk about that period from, say, the 1900 up to into the 1950s. And as an extension from the Industrial Revolution and the ideas about how people in other places were being inefficient or not working the land correctly, there basically arose this thought that Westerners assumed others were inefficient or just dumb, that they didn't know how to actually work the land in the correct way, like it should be worked. An idea also that emerged, it's not in your textbook, but I think you should know about it, is the idea of the tragedy of the commons. And I think this actually emerged in the 1960s. And it's basically the idea that in places where people hold land in common or hold resources in common, that there's no incentive not to just put out one more, to just, if you hold a lake in common, to just take one more fish for yourself. Or if you hold a pasture in common, to put one more cow out there to graze it. And so the tragedy of the commons is that when everybody acts like this on commonly owned land, then the resources will inevitably be overused and they will fall apart, and thus tragedy. I'm simplifying, but that's basically what this idea was about. And the prescription for this idea, or the prescription for the tragedy of the commons, was, let's privatize these things. And if you have private land and private resources, then people won't overuse and overfish them and overdo it. Now, we'll talk about why that's pretty nuts, but so around this time is the emergence of anthropology. Anthropologists go out there, and unlike others, at least anthropologists began to understand that the people they were studying had skills, had technical skills, they had knowledge about their environment. In fact, anthropologists would go places and would be unable to survive without depending upon the people they were with. So you had to recognize how much the people you were with and studying with had these kinds of skills. Anthropologists also documented that, in fact, indigenous peoples could come up with social agreements about use and overuse of land and resources, and had different ways of controlling that. It wasn't necessarily going to be a tragedy of the commons. But during this time, anthropologists and non-anthropologists, and perhaps even the people themselves, assumed that these kinds of things were going away, that everybody had to modernize or everybody had to develop, and that it was anthropologists' job to sort of document these things before all the indigenous people converted and became more like Westerners. And this extended into this idea, which we talked about in the last class, that everybody needed to develop along the lines of what had happened in the Industrial Revolution, and that would be through the use of science and industry and industrialization. And so, again, there was this idea that everyone needed to modernize, and to modernize, you needed electricity, and you needed power plants, and you needed to dam up your rivers where you need to drill, you needed to get electricity in any way, and we all needed to have cars and roads and automobiles. Now, these were the common assumptions. I think looking back on things from hindsight, we can say that extracting things to put them into the profit enterprise of capitalism, privatized extraction, is in many cases not exactly an efficient way to do things. That's what causes the overuse of resources and the destruction of habitats. And so it turns out to be not the smartest idea that we've had. And the first places that this was visited upon were places like Potosí, which is an environmental disaster today. You take out all the silver and leave a polluted environment. Or plantations, which overplanted their land and ended up with soil that was exhausted. Or industrial wastelands like the kinds that we see in parts of the Midwest and other areas, or places where oil was drilled, that just become not very habitable. And in fact, these kinds of environmental consequences were often first felt on lands that once belonged to indigenous people, or in places where this kind of extraction had first occurred. And so in some ways, the indigenous and African American and African populations and places where these, on various islands where things were extracted, were the first to feel the environmental effects, even if they weren't felt in the so-called first world or industrialized economies. And so there's, somebody. Good, yeah. I mean, there's, like I said, a lot of these things happen in places that were once really formative for the colonial enterprise and are felt heavily in these kinds of places. I've actually been hoping that her book would come out, Body Burdens, Toxic Endurance and Decolonial Desire in the French Atlantic, but it's still in preparation. So that makes me sad, because the last time I looked, I taught this class 2 years ago, it was still in preparation. So hopefully it comes out soon. So in this chapter, Guest tells us that anthropology does a lot about the root causes of some of the issues that we have. And I hope that in this little tour through the global economy and environment, we get a sense of that. I also want to just put in there that since these places were often the places in which the environmental issues first arose, that there has been a long-standing indigenous critique of industrialization, of capitalism. And so when we think about the environmentalism movement of the 1960s, which frankly often looks very white, bourgeois, middle class, we should remember that there has been for many years an indigenous movement and critique of the industrial system. And so as we think about all the things that have gone away or been destroyed and wrecked, there's today a lot of indigenous revival, in the sense that the people that anthropologists believe would be gone or have melted away and everybody believed would be gone are currently in some ways emerging as a potent political force. And Guest discusses from page 472 to 474 the Standing Rock protests and the protests against the Dakota Access Pipeline, which was a big deal a few years ago. But you see that, in some ways, indigenous peoples are not about to disappear, and they seem to be contributing to our hopefully helping right some previous wrongs. I also want to mention, somebody who's not here gave us the example of Carolyn Rouse, who gets featured in this chapter as Anthropologists Engage the World, who talks about building houses and how to build a house in Ghana. And she talks about how they use that most houses, or as she puts it, too often when people build modern houses, they build with cinder blocks which hold in heat. Then you need air conditioning, which obviously does not contribute to environmental sustainability. So we used earthen bricks. The windows are placed to enhance airflow and keep the classrooms cool naturally. That's what we need here with this classroom built with cinder blocks, and then I have to turn on the AC. I had earthen structures that could cool this place down naturally. She is also working on a book, but it's still in manuscript form, called Development Hubris, which is a great title. Hubris, being too wrapped up in your own proud ideas, adventures trying to save the world. That'll be a great book. So, near the end of this chapter, Guest, I think, perhaps in bigger terms than he has in previous chapters, discusses this as an urgent matter for us. And I think it is worth highlighting here, as Guest does, that time is short for our planet and the other species with which we live. So these are really important issues. I think it's good to put them in the context of the global economy, but we also need to be rather urgent. I wanted to mention that this guy comes up also, Stefan Helmreich. You might recognize from that video I showed you about doing anthropology, and he was down in the submersible. And so this is his book from that field work, Alien Ocean. And Guest uses it to say something that I think is interesting, that if we imagine life without humans, or life in which humans are deeply enmeshed with other non-human life, can we also imagine a new collective entangled future that can move us beyond our current environmental destruction? Back to optimism, chipping away at the wall, maybe. That'd be good.